Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tuesday, September 12th, 2017 developers call for IPython and Jupyter. Hope we're doing well this week. We are working off an agenda that's in Dropbox paper, which is linked in the chat box. And it looks like the first update will be from Matthias on IPython. We do have links at the top of the agenda for weekly news by organization if you're interested in checking those out. But we will go ahead and get started with IPython updates. Go ahead, Matthias.
Thank you, Anna. So I'm slowly revamping up the IPython development again. I haven't touched it in a couple of weeks, in particular because of JupyterCon. And because we haven't had a release in 2 or 3 months, I'm going to try to get a bug fix of both the 6 branch and the 5 branch in the next few weeks. I'm going to try to fix the most important issues and release something without a lot of new features. To help me with that, since yesterday/this morning, our bot can automatically decide to backport PRs. You don't have to mention it. There was still a bug this morning, but it should be fixed. So now if you tag something as milestone 5.5 or 5.6, when you merge the PR into master, the bot will automatically trigger and backport that for you, which is one less things to do. And of course, if it can't backport, it will tell you, hey, can you backport manually? And I'm going to work with Crystal Graph on Friday. Apparently, the Matplotlib organization is interested in having something similar because they have a lot of PRs they are backporting, and we will try to make the bot compatible with the Matplotlib organization, so that you can just activate it with one button, and all the PR in Matplotlib would also be backported. I don't know if Thomas is on the call, but he sent an email this morning asking whether he could remove some old labels that are on the IPython repository. Because right now we have probably 30 labels and it's quite a lot. There are a number of labels we're not using anymore because it was before Milestone were a thing on GitHub. So if you have any disagreement that some of these labels should be removed, please join the mailing list thread and explain why you would prefer for it to not be removed. And that's about it for IPython. I also have one thing on governance, which is just the next section, so I'm going to directly go into that. We have some discussion about the licensing guideline of our repository due to recent PRs. So if you haven't seen that and are interested in how we handle all the licenses in the Jupyter and IPython project, please come see the governance report. And that's it for me.
Okay, great. Thanks, Matthias. And Jessica, go ahead and share updates on documentation, please.
Yeah, so with regards to follow-ups from JupyterCon, again, I'd like to solicit feedback for the demo from anyone who's presented. Jason and I will be presenting at Strata in New York, so any sort of feedback would be helpful. I know, Carol, you mentioned as well that you like to give feedback from I think PyCon Poland. Also, I'm hoping to get additional notes from the UX testing on what sort of things we might need to clarify in terms of Jupyter Lab based on like typical FAQs or like any other kinds of like things we might want to clarify through documentation. Still waiting to hear back from the results of the UX testing. And then as another smaller thing, that we have now a FAQ in the documentation of Jupyter Lab and also FAQ in the actual Jupyter Lab app. And so I'd like us to think about, like if we want to borrow language between the two or any sort of changes we might want to make in the language of these two documents and how similar we want them to be.
Okay, great. And it looks like Carol's asking you for links, Jessica. And the next on the agenda is Grant, but I don't think he's here. I believe he's traveling. So we'll move on to updates for NB Convert from M.
We released 5.3.1 to address the license issue that was brought up last week. Just to remind anyone, in light of the recent changes and all of the stuff that's happening with licenses, make sure that you also change your manifest.in so that it's included with your source distributions, so that, say, Arch people, I think that's who it was, are happy with the package that you give them, that they know that it is like an open source like package. The other bit is that as part of the release, the Conda Forge team encouraged us to go to no Arch. I don't entirely know what that means, and that might be why I was thinking it was the Arch Linux people that were saying something about licenses, which it may not be anymore. Maybe it was Debian. But I'm not sure entirely what that means. Thomas was the one that had more expertise with working with this. It might break entry points, in which case it might break ND-convert. This sort of happened after we did our release, and so anyone who, say, is working on Windows, I gather, has the most danger of entry points breaking. It probably shouldn't be an issue, but we are testing the water for the rest of the project inadvertently because of when we happen to do our release. So thank you to the Conda Forge people for helping us get that out. If anyone has any issues, please raise them on the NBConvert repo. Does anyone have any questions or comments on that? Or I'm going to move on to NB format.
Just FYI, the no arch means no architecture. So usually there's a build per architecture, like a build for OS X, a build for Windows, a build for Linux. No arch just means that it's a pure Python package that'll work on any architecture. So you only have to build it once, and it'll work across all the architectures instead of a separate build for each architecture. Arch is probably an interesting, I guess it's a common abbreviation for that, but I can see where that is very confusing.
But yeah, there we go.
I was going to make this comment, but if you can put a link to the discussion, then we can write that up in this discussion.
I will do that right after. If you could put a note, I will then add that link. But I'm going to need to go on and talk about NB format for right now. But then I'll do it. All right. So on NB format, so one thing is bringing up names, cell names. So these are metadata objects that are supposed to be unique across the notebook. We don't actually have any way today of verifying that, and there are no tests as far as I can tell for that criterion. And we'd been stating it like it was an absolute truth, but we actually can't specify this in the JSON schema because of the way that it's structured. It tries to pay attention to the structure of the document and not the values of the document. And so while we can have unique keys or unique items in a single array, we can't have it across a bunch of different objects. So this opens up the question of, should we start like actually implementing checks for this in the various front ends? Because if we want to encourage people to use this feature and we want to encourage them to, say, trust the uniqueness of these things, we should probably deliver on that trust in some way. Did anyone have any comments about that before I move on? I will take silence as absolute consent and total agreement on that being the next major focus of getting cell names uniqueness implemented across all of the platforms. Great. So then the other piece is a notebook issue officially, but it actually is more closely related to NB format, which is this long-running tags conversation about the role of them on the front end versus the back end. We know now that the raises exception is going to be an officially supported Jupyter metadata tag. We'll have to include that in NB format. But the question that still needs to be addressed before we can really do a final edits on whatever our documentation there is getting to some degree of consensus about what our policy actually is. So far right now, it's been mostly people like weighing in here and there, but but a lot of seeming to talk past each other, not necessarily disagreeing, but just focusing on different aspects of the problem. And so if anyone else could, I attempted my overarching summary of what was going on, and I got some things wrong. So if more people could participate in that conversation, it'd be great, because then we can move it over out of the notebook repo and into the NB format repo and actually have an official tag policy that we can point not only our developers to, but third-party developers and users as well. That includes the possibility of having, so in the way that NBConvert is using tags, is it allows people to use whatever tags they want, and then they specify them on their, like as a configuration option using traitlets, and then we can perform operations on that. Right now, it's just filtering things out. But this seems to be a useful model, but I kind of wanted to get people's intuitions on how easily that could be used in the front-end context, where you might want to be constantly updating this list or changing it for any of the features you'd want to assign. And so that's probably going to be a new conversation. But if anyone had any initial thoughts, I figured we could talk about them here, and then we could hash out the rest in different issues. Or again, everything I said is perfect, and there is no further comment needed.
I had just a slight question comment. Is there any reason not to move the discussion already into the NB format repo out of
because we may, depending upon if we do agree about the raises exception, I think that's the only thing that would be holding up the release of 5.1. That would be technically the reason it was on the notebook repo, is that that it introduces that official tag, and I'd personally like to have that not a closed issue on the notebook repo before, or to have it closed before we do the release. I'm okay if we have to migrate it and it gets released without us solving this, but it seems like something we should really decide.
Okay, no worries. Thanks.
Happily.
Anything else, Em?
I think those are the main things that I wanted to talk about with the group.
Okay, sounds good. So it looks like there's no major updates for Jupyter Lab, continuing work towards the beta. So Jason, do you want to talk about Jupyter widgets?
Sure. We're just cleaning up a few issues that were reported and releasing a 7.0.1 hopefully later this week or next week. Probably at the end of this week.
All right. Great. Peter, do you want to give updates on services?
Sure. DrStats, there's been a lot of recent pull requests with requests to add libraries, update libraries and languages, support other options. There's a couple linked there. One thing that has happened as I've gone back and forth between this repo and others, like forgotten that we have various options that we support, and we'll merge something that will break it, and Min saved me the other day by catching it. It kind of calls out that we either need some kind of testing around this, which there is an issue for. It's kind of weird to think about testing the Docker image or Docker container with a bunch of software in it, but I think there's a few things we could do there. Or another thing that's come up is, these images have grown quite large, which is, great for people that just want an image that does what everything they want to do plus the kitchen sink. But it does kind of start pushing us into supporting all this. And, we might want to have a discussion about how to get these back to like a starter kit setup. Here's a Docker image that does common things like pandas, scipy, et cetera, for one, and a Spark image, maybe just have one of those instead of two. And then give people perhaps a way to, easily construct either a Docker file or an environment YAML or any of these things from a Jupyter standpoint. So you get, Notebook and/or Jupyter Hub and/or Jupyter Lab plus names of libraries. And if we could provide that to people, that's one way to give them the ability to build their own without having to maintain these massive images. But these are just ideas that have, started to surface based on the problems we're seeing, the growing pains, if you will. And, happy to have some comments in those discussions or other ideas even. Kernel Gateway, we released a 2.01. I think it was early this week, Sunday, or late last week. We haven't made a release of that since May. There really haven't been any issues reported. There was one bug, so we figured we cut a release. The person sent in a pull request. So, yeah, that's out there now. And we got the same request as them about using NoArc in our Conda Forge package. So that did build cleanly. I tried releasing it, and we'll see how that goes. Hopefully it's as simple as adding the NoArc attribute. And finally, in services that I'm aware of, there's a bunch of PRs on MD Viewer that I haven't had time to review. So either I'll get to them at some point, or if anyone else wants to dive in, it's feature requests that people have submitted pull requests for. That's all I've got.
Okay. Any comments on that before we move on to Jupyter Hub? All right, okay, let's move on to Jupyter Hub. Carol, do you want to go ahead and share a little bit?
Yeah, we're just pretty much like Jupyter Lab, just cleaning up some stuff between different beta releases. We released beta 5 last week, and there's a link in the Dropbox paper for what changed since beta 4. So that's it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Carol. And I went ahead and copied over from our August agenda the list of conferences and workshops that we had going within those agendas. So if you have, it looks like a few got added to the end of this list, but if you have any talks coming up or any smaller events that are happening in your community, please add them here, ideally with a link to the event so that folks can click through and take a look at those events. Nothing new to report on JupyterCon. I went ahead and inserted a reminder of the dates and the link to the website for the 2018 event. And then next section is kind of a space where anyone can add action items or things that they want to call out that they'd like help with from the community or from the people on the call. So looks like Pete's adding a note on there for action items. If anyone has anything else to add, please go ahead and put that in there. And then final section is a recap of our releases. So what was released last week, what was coming this week or planned for this week, and what should be released soon in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So if you have notes, release notes that are in the individual topic sections up above, please repeat those plan releases down at the bottom. And I won't talk about them. We just kind of list them there for the sake of keeping a summary of those in our weekly notes. So before we close out, is there anything else that anyone wants to talk about that was not on the agenda or that hasn't been talked about so far? No? Anyone? Last chance. Quick, unmute yourself. Okay, I will go ahead and close off. Thank you, everyone. Oh, Damian.
Yeah, sorry. Just one mention about the release candidate free for the notebook package. It's available data and it's important. I think it contains the fix that Thomas worked out for the MapShacks problem. So that's all.
Yeah, folks on the Mac. There was a fix that Thomas made between release candidate 2 and 3 for some MathJax issues that were popping up for some folks that were using Safari on a Mac. So I tested it this morning as well as when you made the fix, and it seems good on my system, but it was an intermittent issue. So if other folks can check it, that would be fantastic. Thanks.
Based on what I knew of that issue, given that I technically introduced it, it had to do with a race condition between when MathJax was loading an external package and when it was resetting these numbers. And so that's why it was intermittent. And so just putting blanket in promise seems to have been enough to fix that. So way to go, Thomas, on noticing that and figuring out, because I can't imagine that was fun. Or that it was really fun, depending.
All right, great. Looks like there's a note from Jason on the Strata San Jose, which is March 5th through the 8th. The talk deadline or the call for proposal deadline is today. So just putting that out there. Anything else from anyone before we go ahead and sign off? All right. Well, it was great to see everyone. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week, and we'll go ahead and sign off.